Welcome to today's study, where we are going to impartially examine a seriously provocative thesis from the YouTube channel Empathy is Evil. The channel link is below in the description box, and prayers for the Watchmen channels are very much appreciated, so give a hype and like, please. Let's dive right into this full summary and unpack exactly how the source deconstructs a psychological concept that our society almost universally considers to be an absolute moral good. It is a deeply fascinating, highly controversial deep dive, and we are going to meticulously map out every single layer of their argument for you today, so buckle up.
To keep us on track, we're going to break this study down into four main parts. First, the modern empathy paradox. Second, saviors, angels and devils. Third, the roots of empathy. And finally, feelings opposed to truth.
All right, let's kick things off with Section 1, the modern empathy paradox.
The source material begins this section by fundamentally questioning how we even understand empathy today. You know, these days, empathy is frequently defined not just as feeling sympathy for someone, but as the absolute mandatory ability to feel exactly what they are feeling. The channel argues that this specific, rigid definition is currently being pushed by our educational systems, corporate environments, and political spheres as the ultimate aspirational virtue. But they note a profound ethical shift happening right beneath the surface here. We are all pretty familiar with the traditional Christian foundation of the Golden Rule, right? Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. But the source posits that modern society has quietly swapped this out for a new platinum rule. This new rule dictates that we must do unto others as they would have you do unto them. Now, according to the channel, this seemingly tiny semantic shift is actually a massive philosophical earthquake. Why? Because it moves the moral focus entirely away from an objective, universally shared standard of goodness and places it entirely onto validating these subjective, ever-changing desires of others, regardless of whether those desires are actually healthy or even grounded in reality.
This brings us to a really critical question posed by the channel. Does empathy unite us in good, or does it actually unite us in hate? The source argues that empathy isn't this inherent, absolute moral good like we're so often taught. Instead, they claim it's fundamentally just a neutral amplifier of shared feelings that are based entirely on our inherent biases. To really illustrate this, the channel explores the mechanics of how humans unify. Think about it. Cheering in perfect synchronization with 50,000 people in a stadium for a sports team is a deeply empathetic experience. You feel what the crowd feels. But the channel argues that uniting with thousands of people in pure, vitriolic hatred against a specific politician or a competing social group, well, that is also a form of empathy. It requires the exact same psychological synchronization. Therefore, the channel asserts that empathy itself actually has no internal moral compass whatsoever. It merely magnifies a shared bias, which means it can just as easily mobilize a destructive mob as it can build a peaceful community.
Moving right along, let's jump into Section 2, Saviors, Angels, and Devils.
Here, the channel pivots into a really sharp sociological critique. They assert that this modern application of empathy doesn't actually unify society at all. In fact, they argue it does the exact opposite, rigidly dividing our culture into three distinct, highly caricatured castes. The source categorizes modern society into saviors, angels, and devils. According to their thesis, this rigid three-tier framework is the singular lens through which modern society dictates exactly who deserves compassion, and conversely, who deserves total, unforgiving condemnation. The author argues that in everyday cultural interactions, from corporate HR departments all the way to social media algorithms, this caste system is pulling the strings. It ensures that people are no longer treated as complex, nuanced individuals, but simply as avatars of whichever tier they happen to be assigned to. Let's break down exactly how the source defines each of these groups, starting with the group that supposedly holds all the cultural power, the saviors.
The source explicitly characterizes these saviors as affluent, white liberal women. According to the channel's thesis, this specific demographic has culturally positioned itself as the self-appointed guardians of modern morality. They argue that these saviors have somehow managed to gain exclusive control over the rules of empathy, which gives them the unilateral power to dictate exactly who gets to be considered repressed and who is the repressor. It's a bold claim. The channel goes on to say that these saviors use this manufactured empathy to mask a highly paradoxical psychological complex. On one hand, the author argues they harbor a tacit, deeply ingrained feeling of superiority over the groups they claim to help, treating them almost like helpless children. Yet simultaneously, the source claims these saviors experience intense, paralyzing self-loathing about their own demographics and inherent privilege. Empathy, the channel argues, essentially becomes their psychological shield. It allows them to exert immense cultural power while totally pretending to be entirely selfless.
Next up in this framework, we have what the source calls the angels of empathy. These represent various marginalized groups within society. But here's the critical catch according to the channel. Under this modern empathetic system, these groups are totally stripped of their complex humanity and must be viewed as absolutely flawless. The source argues that to practice acceptable modern empathy, society is forced to just completely ignore any faults, bad behavior, or individual responsibilities of anyone categorized as an angel. The channel posits that this creates a toxic, unequal relationship of total dependency. The angels are framed as completely incapable of surviving or advancing without the constant, protective intervention of those saviors we just talked about. The author strongly asserts that this isn't true compassion at all, but rather a soft bigotry of low expectations, where marginalized groups are kept in a perpetual state of victimhood for one reason, just so the saviors can maintain their role as cultural heroes.
Conversely, at the very bottom of this societal framework, the channel outlines the group they term the devils. The author argues that white men, Christians, and conservative individuals are broadly swept into this category and framed as monolithic oppressors. According to the source, the rules of modern empathy absolutely require that this group be stripped of their individual humanity and uniformly blamed for all of society's historical and current ills. And the channel makes a very specific, interesting claim here. They argue that under this savior-dictated framework, traditionally positive traits or values, things like a strong work ethic, punctuality, or valuing the nuclear family, are actively weaponized against them. The source asserts these traits are deliberately reframed as oppressive characteristics simply because they happen to be historically or culturally associated with these so-called devils. Ultimately, the channel claims that empathy is intentionally and strategically withheld from this group just to justify treating them with outright malice.
That takes us to Section 3, the roots of empathy. To substantiate these intense modern sociological claims, the source material actually dives way back into the etymological history of the word empathy itself, arguing that its origins are surprisingly recent and deeply turbulent. They highlight a totally fascinating 2001 Merriam-Webster dictionary definition, which describes empathy as the imaginative projection of a subjective state into an object so that the object appears to be infused with it. The channel leans heavily on this specific phrasing. They use it to argue that, historically and fundamentally, empathy has never actually been about genuine, authentic human connection. It's never been about truly understanding another person's lived reality. Instead, it has always been an exercise in imaginative projection. The source claims that when a savior feels empathy, they aren't actually connecting with the marginalized person, they are simply projecting their own feelings, insecurities, and assumptions onto them, effectively using another human being as a blank canvas for their own emotional experience.
The channel traces the evolution of this concept across a pretty wild historical timeline. They explain that the root concept originated in 18th century German aesthetics with the term einfühling, which translates literally to feeling into. Now back then, it wasn't about people at all. It was about artists projecting their feelings into inanimate objects like a painting, a tree, or a mountain, just to experience a sense of sublime connection. The author notes it wasn't until 1902 that psychologist Edward Titchener tried to bring this concept into English, initially translating it as aesthetic sympathy. Finding that a bit clunky, in 1909 he finally translated it into the English word we use today, empathy. But the source points out that even then it remained a highly obscure academic term for decades. It wasn't until the massive cultural upheavals between the 1950s and 1970s that the concept suddenly burst into mainstream psychology, deliberately repurposed by academics to address the social anxieties of a rapidly changing modern era.
But here is where the source highlights a profound linguistic clash that happened during this translation process. While the conceptual root was the German Einfühlung, meaning to project feelings into inanimate objects, when Titchener needed an English equivalent in 1909, he looked to the ancient Greek word empatha. According to the channel, this is where the entire concept went completely off the rails. They assert that in ancient Greek texts, empatha did not mean compassion. It didn't mean unity or understanding. It historically translated to intense bias, malice, and even hatred. The source views this as the ultimate smoking gun, presenting it as undeniable proof that the English word was conceptually flawed and contradictory from its very inception. They argue it is deeply ironic, yet entirely fitting, that a modern word used by society to demand absolute compassion was literally birthed from an ancient word meaning malicious bias.
As the concept evolved from an obscure aesthetic term into a mainstream psychological tool, the channel cites mid-century psychologists like Kenneth B. Clark to show exactly how its definition was strategically molded.
Clark, who was a highly influential figure, argued that American culture inherently caused people to hate, driven by what he viewed as the deep-seated insecurities and greed of capitalism. The source highlights Clark's specific assertion that the only thing that could possibly save society was a universal increase in empathy. The channel uses this historical context to demonstrate how empathy was specifically framed by the academic elite as a required psychological cure for what they perceived as the inherent sickness of white, Western, capitalist culture. According to the author, this was the exact moment empathy stopped being a descriptive psychological term and morphed into a weaponized moral imperative, designed to fundamentally reprogram how citizens interacted with their own heritage. So, summarizing the author's extensive deep dive into its roots, the channel argues that empathy is inherently defined by several troubling traits, most notably narcissism and irrationality. By looking closely at its origins in artistic projection, the channel argues that empathy was never truly about rational understanding or objectively helping another person. Instead, they claim it is an exercise in profound narcissism, an attempt to forcefully project one's own feelings onto someone else. Furthermore, because it relies entirely on feelings rather than established facts, the source labels it as fundamentally irrational. They argue it is a totally illogical attempt to humanize the inhuman or to mentally transform oneself into another group just to steal their perceived victimhood. In the author's view, these foundational traits ensure that empathy will always, eventually, corrupt objective reasoning.
Okay, let's wrap this all up with Section 4, Feelings Opposed to Truth.
In this final section of our study, we examine the channel's ultimate, overarching conclusion, that there is a fundamental, inescapable conflict between the modern practice of empathy and objective reality itself. The source poses a highly critical question that really raises the stakes of their entire argument. Does empathy fundamentally oppose truth? The channel asks if the rigid cultural mandate to prioritize and protect the feelings of the designated angels at all costs necessitates the outright denial of factual, objective truth. They argue that when a society decides that preventing emotional offense is its highest possible virtue, it must invariably begin to dismantle objective reality. Why? Because the truth is very often offensive to those who simply refuse to live by it.
The channel argues that a really stark dichotomy now governs our entire cultural discourse. On one side, you have modern empathy operating as a force that emphasizes protecting subjective feelings at all costs. According to the source, this relentless pursuit of emotional safety frequently requires society to adopt completely irrational, absolute beliefs simply to avoid causing offense to marginalized groups or their saviors. Then, on the opposing side stands objective truth. The author argues that while truth can absolutely be blunt, it can be uncomfortable, and sometimes it's even deeply hurtful to our feelings, it is fundamentally what informs, builds, and strengthens a free and functioning civilization. The channel's thesis is that you simply cannot serve both masters. A culture must eventually choose whether it will be guided by the comforting illusions of empathy or the harsh, necessary realities of truth.
The source then applies this rigid dichotomy to several highly debated modern issues, asserting that the rules of empathy constantly force society to accept irrational absolutes in order to protect feelings. For example, they claim that during times of civil unrest, the dictates of empathy demand that highly destructive, violent riots be officially described by the media and politicians as peaceful protests, because acknowledging the violence would supposedly reflect poorly on the marginalized groups involved. Similarly, the author argues that the integrity of elections is treated not as a matter of objective verification, but of emotional convenience, claiming elections are deemed completely secure unless, of course, the saviors happen to lose. The source even points to the rhetoric surrounding climate change, arguing that demands for extreme civilization-altering measures like massive population reduction are framed as empathetic necessities, prioritizing irrational environmental panic over factual, measured scientific reality. In all these cases, the channel argues, truth is willingly sacrificed on the altar of empathy.
Ultimately, the channel concludes that empathy does not operate as a bridge between communities, like we all want to believe, but rather as a highly effective tool for endless psychological projection and cultural manipulation. What we collectively call modern empathy, the author asserts, is simply the continuous, irrational projection of the savior's own deep-seated insecurities, self-hatred, and guilt onto everyday people whom they secretly view as subhuman or incapable. By masquerading their manipulative control under the universally respected, noble guise of compassion, these self-appointed guardians are able to seamlessly enforce their will upon society without ever having their actual motives questioned or challenged.
We conclude this study with the source's most provocative final thought. They ask the viewer directly, is empathy an inherently anti-truth, destructive force in modern society? The channel leaves viewers with the stark, uncompromising assertion that anything inherently opposed to truth, which they firmly claim modern empathy is, can only be inherently evil. They warn that elevating a subjective feeling above objective reality is not just a simple semantic error. It is a fatal societal flaw that will inevitably lead to the eventual collapse and destruction of a free society. It is a very heavy, highly controversial thesis that aggressively attempts to flip a widely accepted, foundational virtue entirely on its head, ultimately challenging viewers to totally rethink the very nature of compassion.
As we wrap up this full summary, a big thanks for the Gospels Compared members for helping this channel produce fruit.